Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Elizabeth Newberry, and I'm a director in the Serious Games Initiative here at the Wilson Center and the Science and Technology program. For over 30 years, women have remained noticeably underrepresented in science and technology fields. In STEM jobs, only 24% are filled by women. For education, in some fields, such as computer science, women make up less than 20% of those earning bachelor's degrees. And this difference is even more pointed for women of color, where the disparity is even more striking. This is a problem for the U.S. workforce. Research shows that when there is a diversity in the workplace, there is higher potential for innovation. For the U.S., missing half of the talent pool impacts our potential competitiveness and innovation in a technology-driven economy. But the question is, what can we do about it? This is a complicated problem, and together with the Women in Public Service Project and the Science and Technology program here at the Wilson Center being a think tank founded by Congress to be a bridge between ideas and policy, we aim today to start a dialogue that focuses on one element of this issue: what happens to women once they enter STEM careers, and how might we make strides towards parity? For hiring practices to workplace culture to imposter syndrome, multiple factors create barriers and prevent women from achieving successful careers. But it is one thing to talk about the issue in abstract numbers, and another to look at the problem on the ground. To really understand what is going on, we wanted to bring together a panel of women in STEM who have championed diversity in their respective fields, but who have also managed to personally surmount some of the barriers that are facing women in STEM. Through not only their expertise and personal experience, we want to have a rigorous conversation on the barriers and opportunities for women in STEM and the actions that can be taken to achieve gender parity in those fields. I've asked the panel to not prepare presentations, which I know is a little bit of an oddity here in Washington, D.C., but instead to come prepared to talk about their experience through a series of questions. The first half of the panel will consist of panelists responding to these prepared questions briefly, and I've asked them to try to respond within 2 to 5 minutes each. For the second half, we will turn over the floor to questions that I pull from the chat. Simply due to the size of our participant pool, our panelists will not be able to answer questions as they come into chat, but I will try to be monitoring it. So if you have a question, please send it in the chat to all panelists and participants. There's a little drop-down availability, so don't send it to one individual person, but all participants and panelists. And that way I will monitor it and we can make sure that our panelists see that. Also, although we'll be hosting the Q&A at the end, please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. I will try to be keeping my eye on the chat box and introduce questions as I fit into the flow of the conversation. Thank you all in advance for your patience and enthusiasm. I would like to now introduce our panel, but in the spirit of equality, I would like them to actually introduce themselves with answering the question, how did you get started in your field? And we'll begin this with Carol. Carol, unfortunately, you're still muted.
I knew that was going to happen. My name is Carol O'Donnell, and I work at the Smithsonian, directing the Smithsonian Science Education Center. And we're located here in Washington, D.C., in the nation's capital, but we also work across the globe. And so how did I get started in my field? Actually, to be honest with you, when I was younger, I was very interested in solving problems. I was always engineering solutions to problems, always in my backyard, which I treated like my lab, growing up in inner city Pittsburgh. And I was incredibly interested in science as well as math, and I was a good student in both of those fields. And I think my parents thought that I would go on to become an engineer, but I really loved teaching. So I ended up majoring in education, sadly to say, much to the dismay of my parents who wanted to see a female engineer in their family. But I love and had an incredible passion for teaching others. Now, the way I got started in my field was the fact that I was able to engage in teaching others, and then learned about the Smithsonian and the work that the Smithsonian was doing. So after about a decade of teaching science, I actually came to the Smithsonian to share science knowledge with kids all over the globe. So I'll stop there.
Great. And then I would like to introduce Mayra.
Good morning. My name is Mayra Montes and I work at NASA. My job here right now is program executive. I work in the Science Mission Directorate and I do high-level management of Earth science missions. Right now I have 4 projects and I have one that is flying. We launched it in December and it's monitoring the sun and it's very exciting. I'm a computer engineer by training. But let me tell you a little bit about where it all started. I started actually in chemical engineering in college, but I felt very isolated in that department. I felt that there was no one there to help me learn the ways of college. I was a student from Puerto Rico. My first language is Spanish. My written English is very good, but my spoken English needed a little bit more work. And there was no one in that department that reached out to me. So in frustration, I decided to go down the list of engineering majors alphabetically because I am a very organized person. So I decided to skip civil because I was not interested in bridges, or I thought that's what they did. And the next stop was computer. Well, it turns out the computer science department, computer engineering, was a very new department at the University of South Florida. And it was very, very diverse. And it felt like home. There were people there from all over the world. There were many, many women. And for me, it was the right choice. Interestingly, it was not so much about a shared language, but that broader culture in the computer engineering department that really attracted me to stay there. Oddly, I didn't see it as a male dominated field at that time. And in fact, the years that I was studying there were the peak, unknown to us, that it was the peak of women in computer engineering degrees. So I don't know what happened. I really do not understand why we have not been able to retain those numbers, because it's a wonderful, very challenging area of study. My first job was as an engineer at the NASA Kennedy Space Center. This was after the Challenger explosion, when they were trying to build up the workforce again. And NASA is an agency that's very conscious of hiring women. So I was hired into the electrical engineering group, and about half of my coworkers were women, which is unbelievable. It's still very remarkable to me. And again, I felt very much at home. So for me personally, I like comfort in numbers, and I like to work with women. Oddly, I had one job at NASA where I was the only woman with 6 men, and I loved it as well because of the type of work I did was very meaningful to me. So for me personally, I love to work with women. I also love to work with men, but I find it quite the joy to be able to share in my awesome nerdiness with other women. And that's what I have to say.
I mean, awesome nerdiness with other women sounds great to me. Tabby, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Good morning. My name is Tabby Heller-Jordan. I'm the president and CEO of the Paradigm Forum, which is a global think tank headquartered in Zurich, Switzerland. And we work at the intersection of workplace innovation and social justice. I was reflecting the other day in terms of sort of the trajectory of my career. And in all honesty, I recall catching the social justice bug actually in high school. Where I volunteered to be a coordinator of a women's rights advocacy platform in Boston. And I was incredibly intrigued with how one drives change and what are the tools that one is required to leverage to both not only build awareness, but to deepen engagement around fundamental social issues. And I subsequently then took my junior year off because I had the opportunity to work for an environmental planning consulting firm that had a very specific focus on engaging local citizen groups and advisory committees, again, to drive change. And what I discovered and really came to appreciate in that experience is the power of a stance that's deliberately non-adversarial, but actually using research to better anchor people's thinking in alternatives and so forth. So I became extremely interested in the power of research and the power of somehow integrating fundamental social justice principles with a pragmatism of bottom line impact. So in terms of the current work that we're doing at the think tank is we are focusing our energies at three different levels. First of all, the public policy arena with national governments, because again, there's a growing appetite to try to figure out how we can certainly drive gender parity at a very high strategic level. We also work with the public and private sectors that are preoccupied with finding good talent. And certainly in the STEM area, there is significant competition in this space in terms of the value proposition that these institutions can offer. And then lastly, working with the academic sector, because they have received feedback from the public and private sectors that they are not necessarily producing the talent that we will need for the future. So there's a growing appetite, I think, in academic environments to really revisit the pedagogy. And we've been very, very interested in some of the innovations in the STEM space as a result of that. And so delighted to contribute and participate in today's conversation.
Great, thank you so much. One of the things I wanted to pick up on from what you were just saying, Tabby, is this idea of how do we situate and describe the problem that is happening in women in STEM. So we've heard a lot of metaphors, whether it's glass ceilings, glass walls, as this particular webinar is called, pipelines, pathways, leaky pipelines. I'm sure that I'm missing a few there, but do you have a preferred way of conceptualizing the problem? If we're thinking about the barriers that women are facing in STEM, is there a good way to sort of situate ourselves towards that problem? And we'll start with Mayra this time.
Sure. So I like to be very positive about things. And I really think that one of the biggest things we need to work towards is to get more women in STEM, right? We're talking about that. But the way I see it is not as a pipeline or a leaky pipeline, but actually a highway mixing bowl. And the reason for this is that at least in engineering, and I know it's different for women that want to stay in academia, for example, but at least in engineering, it's a very, very versatile degree to get. And I feel that in engineering, one can hop onto this highway in the mixing bowl and work in engineering, get off a ramp, do something else. I have many colleagues that work right now in STEM education, but their degrees are still in engineering. So they can still get jobs back in engineering if they choose to. For example, I worked at the National Science Foundation in policy for 9 years. And now my job is back in engineering where, it can be done, but it requires one to stay engaged and maintain a lot of networks and contacts. But that's the way I see it. It's more like a mixing bowl highway for engineering, at least.
That's great. I've not heard that one. We might have to code it or for this particular.
That's right. We'll do the patent for it.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll share it with you.
Toby, do you have a metaphor that you prefer to use? You're muted still, sorry.
Just to build on your previous comment and Mayra's comment as well, I do think we are sort of drowning in a whole sea of competing metaphors. I don't know if you mentioned sticky floor, labyrinths, glass escalators, and so on. And I think my frustration with many of these metaphors is I do believe a metaphor has to serve two purposes, right? I think it has to capture the challenge accurately, but it also has to serve to kind of galvanize the right kind of action and intervention. And that's my frustration, is that most of these metaphors fall down on that front. One, because I think they oversimplify the complexity of the issue. I think we have a tendency, frankly, to confuse symptoms and root causes with some of these metaphors, and we confuse also means and ends. So at the end of the day, I'm not a big fan. While it's not a metaphor, one of my favorite sort of notions in terms of my growing frustration with the lack of progress is moving deck chairs on the Titanic, because what I see is a lot of energy going into, by and large, interesting policy and programmatic interventions, but those will not in any way be a sufficient counterweight for sort of the obsolete way of thinking, right? About careers, our ambitions, how to leverage talent, and so forth. So I do think that one of the big challenges is that we have to be far more targeted in understanding and addressing what are the real challenges. And a lot of these issues around STEM are often discussed in the abstract. And I think we need to get down to the specifics. So I'll give you a funny story that occurred that a biochemist colleague of mine shared. She works for a pharmaceutical company, and the CEO makes a habit of walking around the hallways just to ask people a very pointed question. You know, what one thing would change your life or be very helpful to you in terms of your ambitions at this company? And her response is, I'd like to come in at 10:30 on Thursday morning. And he said, that's it? And she said, yes, that's it. Because I have now had an ongoing discussion with my manager, and there's a lack of flexibility in understanding the reality of some of our competing commitments. And I have every intention of staying at this company, but we should never underestimate how mundane some of the requirements are in terms of actually finessing the right kind of work environment. So I thought that was actually a rather poignant but potent example of, let's get very granular here in terms of what is required, in terms of staying at too high and philosophical level.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree. And one example I give for it is where I work right now, where I have a child. I have to go and take my son to school and pick him up. And so I told my boss, this is going to interfere a little bit with my hours, but don't worry, I will get all the work done. And he looked at me like I was from another planet and says, you have all the tools to do your job from wherever you are. I don't care if you're in the office or not, as long as your work gets done. Mm-hmm. And to me, that was quite the relief to know that I had his support in maintaining my private life with my kids and also being able to do my work well. So I completely agree that there has to be, and it has to be, like you said, very much ingrained in the culture. Mm-hmm. And I will talk a little bit later about the culture that I believe has helped at NASA, for example, make it the number one agency in the federal government. And it's people like my boss, for example. So yes, I love your point, and you're absolutely right.
Thank you so much. And Carol, I think maybe you can also provide a different perspective onto this point that we're making about the obsolete way of thinking about the issue of women in STEM. So I was wondering if you could build on that, thinking of the metaphors that we generally use for STEM education and younger girls and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think the challenge, it's funny, it's not what metaphor works, it's what metaphors we should probably avoid. And, the K through 12, which is a space that I work in, is often referred to as the K through 12 pipeline, the workforce pipeline. And I think one of the reasons why people talk about a leaky pipeline is because the assumption is that with a pipeline, there's only one direction and you head straight through it and then you're going to get somewhere at the end. And the problem is the belief around the leaky pipeline is that we lose people along the way, mm-hmm. whether it's women in STEM or other underrepresented populations. Or in my case, growing up in a very inner city poor neighborhood, how is it that somebody at that level can actually make it to college when college was not the expectation? And so the question is, for me, what metaphors should we avoid? And we certainly should not be talking about getting into the STEM workforce as a pipeline. It has to be a series of pathways. And it kind of goes back to Mayra's point about this highway, that it is almost like a web where hopefully along the way, as you experience new things in your career, you're also introduced to other ideas. And that brings you to new opportunities. And we should never forget the fact that someone who starts off inner city youth in Pittsburgh with no expectations to go to college ends up in a senior executive position at the Smithsonian Institution, leading science education globally. And also, teaching physics at the, graduate school or at the school the physics department at George Washington University. Those things are possible. But if you asked me when I was 10, or even when I was 18, whether or not I expected this to be my path, I would have never imagined it. And so I want to build on, Mayra's point, which is that, as a female, we also have, and I believe males have this as well, this idea of trying to balance our personal and professional life. I have 4 kids who are all adults, and trying to make certain that we are not afraid to speak up for ourselves when it comes to asking for support, asking for accommodations, being willing to say, this is something that I'm capable of doing and can balance both my personal and professional life at the same time, I think is absolutely critical. So I completely agree with Mayra. You're very fortunate, Mayra, that you're in an institution, and I believe the same about the Smithsonian Institution, where people are not only employees, but they're treated as family. But that, and we too, rank very highly in the best places to work survey. But we know that that's not the case everywhere. And we know that women are often the ones who unfortunately are asked to prove ourselves in order to advance. And to go back to this idea of the K through 12 pipeline, if you will, where we're preparing kids for the future workforce, we are doing a good job because we now have 57, 59% of girls majoring in STEM and graduating. But then when they go off to work, that's where we're losing them. So what's happening in the workforce? And that's where we tend to, this idea of obsolescence or being obsolete, it's what's happening once they enter the workforce itself.
Yeah, and I think you hit on a really good point here, that I want to divide it up. So one point that we're talking about is what happens to women once they go into the workforce, and then also what catalysts are important at the very onset to get them to even believe that they can be part of that STEM workforce. And one thing that all 3 of you have sort of touched on a little bit is this idea of parents, the influence of parents and teachers in being those sort of catalysts. There's been several studies that indicate the influence of those sort of role models in going into a STEM career, whether it's no matter the metaphor that we use, the centrality of parents and teachers to being role models, to being motivators for that. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how in your either personal experience you've been a role model, or your parents were role models and integral to that, and how did they do that? How did they help you sort of navigate those barriers that girls encounter at a very young age? Maybe Carol, since you were hot on this issue, we could start with you.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you. It's a great question. The role of mentorship is crucial. We're involved at the Smithsonian Institution in what's called, in essence, a public-private partnership, which is incredibly helpful when it comes to public institutions that don't necessarily have the technological resources or the financial resources. But we're involved in a public-private partnership with Johnson & Johnson in an initiative called Women in STEM, Manufacturing and Design. And so why STEM 2D is the reference. And so the question is, what's the theory around see-do, right? If I see somebody in a role, I'm more likely to believe that I can do it. And in K through 12, when we interview students, we often hear them say, especially in populations where they're typically underserved in STEM, do you think this is something, do you believe that you could become a scientist one day or an engineer? And oftentimes they'll say, oh, I don't think I'm good enough. And when we dig very deeply into what students mean by, what do you mean you're not good enough? They often come out to say they don't have opportunities to see themselves in those roles because they don't see others who look like them in those roles. And there's been plenty of research that talks about the see-do theory, as well as the important opportunities that students have to engage with others who look like them and help them see themselves in those future roles. So in this Why STEM 2D initiative, for example, we try to bring female engineers, scientists, technologists, manufacturers into classrooms and intersect with students as they engage in the practices of science, technology, engineering, and math, so that students have an opportunity to see themselves in others. And one other thing that we do is we ask young students to create an identity map.
Mhm.
So we ask them to think about themselves and their self-identity around a particular scientific issue, or to build on some of the other comments, socio-scientific issues. And then we have the scientist, engineer, technologist also do an identity map. And then we help kids see that they're very similar to the people who are in these prominent roles, and recognize that they're individuals just like this young student is. So it's important for students to see themselves, understand their identity, but also understand the identities of others.
That's a really interesting point, how we can map different identity practices in STEM classrooms. Mayra, I see that you want to jump in here.
I want to jump in here because I love that concept. I make it a point to talk to children in classrooms precisely, and I love to talk to them, especially in Spanish. And we have quite the large Spanish population in this area. And I want them to know that, yes, they can. Yes, it's doable. It is hard. I will not sugarcoat it. It is not, STEM is hard, but it is very much worth it. So for me, my inspiration, my mother was a professor at the University of Puerto Rico. She was a professor in nursing, and my dad was an educator. So that already was a little bit of a more science biased upbringing for me. But my dad was also an artist. So I had that, right brain, left brain thing going. Anyway, but my true inspiration was actually my chemistry teacher in high school. That's why I went into chemical engineering. My chemistry teacher in high school was gorgeous. She bleached her hair blonde before that was a thing. She wore bright red lipstick, and she was a nuclear scientist. She worked in a nuclear plant, and she took us all there to see her old workspace. And I thought that was so inspiring, that this woman had such a cool job. So that really sparked the interest in me, and the knowing that, yes, I could do that too. So I think I absolutely agree with Carol. Mentoring is so important. And I find that it is our responsibility as women in STEM to reach out to children, to girls and boys. It's important for boys to know that women are very capable of doing these lines of work. So I'm with you. Sign me up, Carol.
I really like that point, that it's important for this message to be across for all kids. The demonstration that there can be a diversity of people within STEM fields needs to be available to all children. Sorry, Toby, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, absolutely. I have lots to add to this conversation because I think it's incredibly timely. I mean, we did a very interesting study several years ago in the oil and gas industry looking at the reasons for the absence of women petroleum engineers. And the number one finding was the discouragement that these young women were getting at home. Parents saying, oh, engineering, petroleum, kind of a messy business. You should go into medicine or law. So, this was a very interesting challenge because these young girls were being socialized in an environment where there was a value judgment being made. And, in my own case, I had both my mother and grandmother had incredible careers. And what I so appreciate about the mentoring, and I don't think they'd even use that word themselves, but what they showed me is how not to play the game. And there's a wonderful concept that is used for seeing eye dogs. It's the final test they take to prove whether or not they're legitimate and capable of being seeing eye dogs, and that is intelligent disobedience. And I think we should be cultivating this in young girls and boys much more aggressively. And I also think we owe it to parents. I do a lot of programs in schools about the realities of STEM, and many parents are just grossly ill-informed about the future of work and a number of these issues, but there's a huge appetite to learn what are these issues and how can we create educational environments where there's a growing appetite around innovation and change. I mean, I was very impressed to read what Oracle is doing with their Design Tech High School, where they'll have 550 students. They're going to have incredibly elaborate maker spaces, user experience design, and so on. And so there is very strong evidence out there of what is working. Recently, we've been doing a lot of very dedicated work with girls' high schools and women's colleges. And in these environments, you have very visible and vocal role models. And these young women are so inspired by that energy. And if you look at the statistics, it's incredible. So a college like Bryn Mawr, where the STEM degrees are awarded at almost 2.5 times the national average. The number of mathematics degrees are 11 times the national average. So there is something to be said, I think, also about the experience of single-sex education. And there is something about these environments in the absence of an individual role model. You have a collective role model. You have a community where there is an expectation around women's ambition. And I think we need to cultivate that. And the final point I would make, because we're running a very interesting program on innovation for 8 to 10-year-olds in 30 schools around Europe, we have to get these kids early, because many kids are already kind of formulating a set of assumptions by the time they're 12, 13. We have to go much, much earlier. And my recommendation in that space is teaching these kids entrepreneurial thinking skills. So if you look at a school like Somerset College in South Africa, where they've combined STEM subject matter with entrepreneurship, so you've got the skill set and the mindset coming together and creating an incredible sense of energy and possibility. And I think that's something that is working very well, and we can really learn from these examples of success.
Yeah, Elizabeth, I was wondering if I could build on Toby's comment.
Of course.
Okay, so first of all, Toby, I really appreciate your points. And, you know, one of the things that there was a study done by Psychological Science, it was in 2010. So the question of whether or not this still holds true is, I'm unclear. So in Psychological Science, this researcher did a large survey and tried to find out, why is it that so many young girls don't pursue STEM degrees? And what she discovered was that females have a tendency to believe that STEM fields are not communal. In other words, they are not, they don't do enough to help others. They saw STEM fields as being more agentic, something that brings a person agency or, you know, power, money, position. And I think one of the roles that we play in K through 12 is trying to ensure that students see STEM fields as being communal. You know, the work that we do, whether it's an engineer at NASA or whether it is working in a hospital, obviously many of these STEM fields are just that, are very much helping professions. Whether you're designing a cell phone whose technology ends up improving the lives of youth in places where they're not able to communicate, those are helping professions. They are communal. And so I think part of our job is to also help students understand what science can do to bring these communal opportunities to students, whether it's seeing that understanding climate change is the science behind climate change actually makes a difference in the world that we live in, these kind of socio-scientific issues. So I think, you know, to go back to Toby's point, that it's also about social justice. It's not just the content in STEM, it's also about what you do with that content to help others. So it's our job as educators to make certain that students see those roles as not just agentic, but also communal.
And I really appreciate that you're highlighting some of the norms of STEM fields that are barriers to girls, even before they are at a time where they can really access those STEM fields. So I wanted to shift gears a little bit and think about that sort of the postgraduate scene for women going into STEM. So there's been a growing conversation about the need to focus on what happens to young women post-college or post-education once they enter a STEM career. What do you think is the most critical barrier to young women that are going into these STEM careers? And we actually have a question from chat that I think picks on a little bit what you were talking about, Toby, with the entrepreneurial spirit. So have you considered, it's about women in startups, particularly I would wonder if there are barriers for women to be taken seriously by investors or who are trying to start up a tech-based career. Those are two different questions, but I think that they sort of fit into what you guys have been talking about. Toby, since you have perhaps the most experience in this area, I was wondering if you might take us off from there about women in STEM careers.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very robust question, because I would argue that one of the first myths that need to be busted, if you will, is the myth that work environments are meritocratic, right? Some of them are, but by and large, they are still, equity of access and opportunity is still highly skewed. And I do think there, been a number of articles in the media recently that have looked at how, highly talented women coming into lab environments and so on are coping with a lot of dysfunctionality. And I think what we're seeing is that there is, first of all, much more attention now being paid to not just the technical competence, but relational competence. So we're currently, and I see this in requests from clients, looking at what are the relational competencies that we need to be developing in our management talent, and how do we ensure that those competencies are equitably spread across the work environment. So whether that be empathy, strategies around engagement, storytelling, user-centric design, et cetera. And I find that very encouraging, because I think for a long time we've had an assumption that just doing a good job is sufficient. And I think what we're realizing now is going back to your point, Carol, about the communal nature of the work environment. We have significant responsibilities to create and craft a workplace that engages, that strives to sort of address that entrepreneurial energy. And one of the bits of feedback that I often give companies that are losing women in STEM at a very high percentage is that they really have to consider what are the reasons why people are staying, and what are the reasons why people are leaving, and really having some very insightful data points around this point. And inevitably, when they look at the data, the argument is the culture itself is not meritocratic. I don't feel listened to, I don't feel attended to, and so forth. So my fear is that unless we do change these work environments, many women are voting with their feet at this point, and they are seeing significant opportunities in the entrepreneurial sector. Now, the point about venture capital funding and so on, it's interesting, because this past week I spoke in Zurich at a launch, a concept of a collaborative work environment for women specifically. And these collaborative communities are opening up globally. And I think what women are recognizing is we need to come together as a force to be reckoned with, bring venture capitalists, angel funding, et cetera. So I do think there is a growing frustration that the rate of change within some institutional environments is not keeping pace with the ambition of the talent. Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing a real influx. And I'm not saying that the entrepreneurial sector has everything solved, but I think we run the risk of losing critical talent if we don't create more inclusive, engaging workforces with managers understanding the social competencies that are required to retain top talent.
Yeah. So Toby, I just want to add one quick thing to your point, because I think this is absolutely crucial. Again, no matter how good of a job we do in K through 12, as well as undergraduate and graduate, to prepare students for workforce, once they enter it, if we do not have those kinds of environments that accept women in workforce that is typically not dominated by women, then we'll never win this battle. In the United States, I was an outside advisor for the Pew Research study that was done last year, 2017, just released in January. And one of the things that they found was that women who enter the STEM workforce feel isolated. They feel like they're treated as if they're incompetent. They believe they've been passed over for more important assignments, denied promotions, and earn less than men are earning, even given the same job. And so you're correct that this is a major problem in the field. And for us as educators, one thing we're trying to do is build those social skills that allow students, women in particular, young girls in particular, to accept and to be empowered, to be able to address those social ills that they may face when they enter a STEM workforce. So.
And I completely agree. And from the point of view of the federal workforce, where it's my limited experience, it has taken, of course, nudges from laws to be able to force the agencies to learn certain behaviors, But for example, at NASA, it started with a very enlightened director we had who would not even consider SES positions unless he had the evidence that a diverse group of people had been interviewed for the job with the rationale as to why the person was selected was indeed better. And that kind of set the tone back in the 90s to today, where the leadership makes a point to have a diverse and inclusive workforce. But again, these were not practices that suddenly, somebody was enlightened, let's do it now. It's taken 15 years to see the difference. And I can tell you, because I was at NASA for 15 years, I left for 9 and now I'm back. And it's a completely different agency because it took that long to get the entire agency thinking more in those terms.
So I think this segues really nicely to another question that we have from chat. And so we're going to open up briefly to the question and answer portion of this. I know we only have 10 minutes and I'm sorry for the questions. But this question is specifically about women of color and promoting diversity in research populations. There's a work on that happening in the public sector, but how do we project parallel results with funding diversity for women of color, for promoting diversity in the private sector? And Mayra, would you mind leading off with that?
I actually have no experience in the private sector.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm curious though. Like I said, in the federal government, there are laws. And it took that push to force people to change behaviors. And now, after so many years, I personally am starting to see that there's been a change.
Yeah, I guess where my mind was in trying to explain those policies that were put in place. And I really appreciate the longitudinal, the fact that it took a while to get to a point where it is today. But I see that Toby wants to jump in potentially.
Sure. Yeah, it's a very, very good question. And I'll tell you where I feel quite optimistic is the field of data analytics tied to human capital in the private sector has become increasingly sophisticated. So the good news is that companies are now collecting much more qualitative and quantitative data, one, to figure out what is the nature of our population, but more importantly, what are the appropriate interventions, whether at a policy and programmatic level or workplace cultural level or flexibility level and so on, a mentoring level, et cetera, so that companies can be more fact-based in their interventions and can have a better basis for evaluating the impact of what they're doing. So there is a huge appetite about collecting and actually disaggregating data on women, right? Women are not a monolithic group. And one of the points that I'm constantly stressing is there's actually research would confirm more diversity among women than between men and women. So we really have to define what women are we talking about. And I think we have to overlay that not only with a variety of different demographic categories, and certainly generational difference is significant. I mean, most private sector companies now have 4, if not 5, different generations, and those generations have oftentimes vastly different perspectives on what's going on and what they want and what they need and so on. So this notion of diversity within diversity is becoming, I think, par for the course. I don't have any statistics at my fingertips, but I can say with incredible conviction that this is a big topic in the private sector, and there is a growing sense that, my word, we need data to be intelligent, informed, and impactful in terms of how we are going to address women of color's, the concerns that we have not been addressing from my standpoint with as much rigor as we need to.
Yeah, and this is Carol. I'll add just one thing. Well, actually, 2 things that are somewhat different from each other, but address the question. The first is that when, one is around funding, and the other was around this really complex theory of action. And so the first is in terms of funding. So earlier, Elizabeth noted that women tend to make, I think it's like 80 cents. This is what the Pew Research study found out, like 80 cents on the dollar for every dollar a male makes. And in professional, more advanced degree fields, they only make 73 cents on the dollar. Well, that's not fair. Mm-hmm. And so there was a recent policy shift. I don't know whether the bill was proposed or whether it actually passed in the US, but it was about getting rid of this history of looking at your salary history as a female, and in order to determine your current history. In other words, you know, if you're doing the same work, you should be paid, and everything else is similar, you should be paid the same amount. But the problem was we were using salary history to determine current salary. Well, that's a, you know, self-perpetuating problem. And so this policy bill was to allow companies, private companies, to be able to say, no more. We need to support the fact that if you're doing equal work, equal pay. The second thing I wanted to raise is around this complex theory of action. So if we want to increase the diversity of the STEM teaching workforce, or increase the diversity of the STEM workforce in general, we have a very complex theory of action. So as a K through 12 educators, we have to make certain that students from multiple populations, very diverse populations, have access to good STEM education, help them hopefully pursue those STEM degrees when they go off to college. And then again, back to this idea of mentorship, see themselves in others so that they feel as if that's a role that they can pursue. And once they do enter the workforce, that these policies are in place that prevent this kind of discrimination that often happens, not just with women, but often in other underrepresented or minority populations in STEM.
Yeah, so this actually segues nicely to another question, and is that if you could make a single recommendation on how we could transform and diversify STEM careers, what would it be? And particularly, I want to highlight something from chat. One of the tenors that we've had is to focus on women at a very young age when they're going into the STEM career, but there also is some evidence of an ageist factor where women, as they get older and are still pursuing leadership positions in STEM, there might be some discrimination around age that intersects with the gender identity. So if we could talk about policy recommendations or industry moves that the private and public sector might make, I would open the floor to that discussion.
I can kick off with a couple of ideas, you know, and it's not unrelated to my point about data. The good news is that I think there's a growing impatience with the lack of progress. So I think one of the things that's now being looked at is how can we add more transparency and accountability on the shoulders of individual managers, executives, et cetera, to ensure that impact has occurred. So one of the things that we've noticed, and I'll speak at least to the private sector, is that there are more and more companies now that are attaching a percentage of people's discretionary bonuses to their success in creating an environment that is experienced as inclusive, meritocratic, opportunistic, et cetera. So rather than putting the onus of responsibility for transforming these cultures on individual women entering the environment, the argument is, you know what, this is a shared objective, and we need to ensure that we have people who are managing other people who, one, are capable of doing that, and frankly, two, will be held accountable to a performance standard that we have identified. So I'm a big believer, and it's not necessarily the shame game, but I do believe we need to hold people accountable. And I think for a long time now, we have somehow argued that these so-called soft skills in managing people and creating an inclusive work environment are things that we don't necessarily have to focus on explicitly. So one of the other things that we've seen very good progress in the STEM area are formal sponsorship programs where individual women are getting sponsored. And so it's not an accidental connection that you have with someone, or you hope that you can find a mentor. Companies are actually training people to be good sponsors. They have performance metrics attached to that and so on. So I think the argument in the change space is, do you work with attitudes and hope that behaviors catch up? Or do you force the behavior and hope that attitudes catch up? And frankly, given the dearth of talent and the competition around talent now, Most organizations are now erring on the side of, you know what, we have to define the behavior, we have to raise the bar in terms of accountability. And we are seeing very promising shifts with that level of transparency and accountability. So that would be one area where I think there has been some very good progress.
And I have to add to that, I was at a leadership conference at NASA just last week, and the administrator of NASA let us know. I didn't know this was happening. The SES, they're evaluated, they're the Senior Executive Service of Government. They're the highest ranked government workers there are. They're evaluated on 5 elements. And he says at NASA itself, they focus on the softer skills because they know the bean counting is there. It's obvious. We launched stuff to space. We're very successful. But what about those softer skills? Are you promoting a good work environment for all workers? So it was very heartening to me that that has been part of the evaluation. And I think, like I said, I left, I came back, it's a completely different agency. And that is why, because everybody is accountable. In addition, the mentorship is very, very important. And you're right, Toby, but if the companies do not have that infrastructure, there are other organizations, for example, professional societies for women, that can help in getting you a mentor, at least opening doors so you can find someone that can help you work through many things. Elizabeth, you mentioned very briefly the imposter syndrome. So we all need mentors. I have many of them. So I love your ideas, Toby. And I think you're right. You know, we're seeing that it is making a change, but change does not happen randomly. It must be forced.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and this is Carol. I'll just say one quick thing as we kind of draw this particular conversation to a close, which is that, you know, this idea of soft skills, again, as educators, I think one of the things that we're really trying to do is not just develop students' technical skills, but you've heard this expression, you know, hard skills will get you in the door, but soft skills will keep you there. So I think one of the things that we also have to do with young girls as we educate them in STEM fields is also help them to address and know how to handle these situations in which they might be asked to do things which are demonstrating bias or discrimination. And so helping students as youth develop these not only technical skills, these hard skills, but also develop the soft skills that will allow them to persist. So grit becomes just as important in persisting in STEM degrees as well as STEM fields as the technical skills do. So hard skills will get you in the door, but soft skills will keep you there.
So I know that we are short on time, so I wanted to give the panel a last 30-second overview if there's any last words that you wanted to have on this particular issue. Obviously, we can't solve the barriers to women in STEM in just a 1-hour panel. So if you'd like to continue the conversation, I would encourage you to follow us on Twitter, Wilson STIP, S-T-I-P, as well as the Women in Public Service Project and the Wilson Center, which is at the Wilson Center. And we also have made available all of these wonderful women's tweets, bios, and ways of contacting them on our website, which is wilsoncenter.org. Last 30 seconds, speed dating style, thoughts on women in STEM. And thank you all so much for coming.
You're welcome. I'll go first. A quick last thought, which is that don't be afraid to speak up. I've spent my entire career making certain that when I'm in a position in which I believe I'm being discriminated against, which has happened often, I'm not afraid to speak up, but always be professional, always be gracious in doing that.
And I'm going to just say that I am the next generation. I am completely inspired by the next generation. And the only advice I can give is to be there to support each other. And that includes men. We need the entire community to be supportive of, you know, this society that we live in. And also, you know, there are no limits as long as we stay together.
Mm. Yeah, and to build on both Carol and Mayra's comments, I'm a firm believer that it's better to apologize than ask permission as a strategy. And I heard an interesting debate at the Aspen Institute a couple of years ago, and an executive was asked, how he stayed on top of his game. And I loved his response, and I think we can all take something away from this. He said, whenever I have a decision to make, I ask myself, what's the bolder version of this decision? Not that I necessarily take it, but it's good for us to stretch our thinking and to be as expansive as possible about that sense of possibility. So I think if all of us can convey that message to the incredible STEM talent out there, I think that sense of boldness and can do will get us quite far.
Great. Thank you all so very much for attending. And thank you for the panelists for your wisdom and insight into this incredibly important issue. Again, I would encourage everyone to continue the conversation on Twitter @WilsonStiff. We are going to be working diligently on increasing dialogue around the issue of women in STEM. So stay tuned for more policy briefs, panels, and potentially a game about women in STEM fields. Thank you all so much and have a great day.
Thank you.